entire industry developing around this lessons from the MDGs. I think a number of things. I think there's a broad consensus that one of the key things is that they're pretty short. That there aren't too many of them. We all are familiar with these very, very long documents with many, many, many aspirations and not a great deal of nothing to really focus on. So being short, having numbers, I think something very concrete that we can track, so you know whether things are getting better or not, whether outcomes are being met or not. I think in terms of how the MDGs were used, I think two more things. First of all, when you look at how the MDGs have been taken up and used, particularly I think by sort of advocacy groups, civil society, maybe Phil might be going to say more on this. One of the interesting things is that often they've been taken up individually. There's not, we talk about the MDGs, but actually the way people have used them is very much sort of one at a time, more as a menu of things that they can pick out, individual things, the goal on education, the goal on maternal mortality, and use individual goals around advocacy and campaigning. So I think something that can be used together and separately is important, and something that can be used flexibly. You know, we didn't necessarily know in 2000 how the MDGs were going to be used and by who. They've been used for monitoring, they've been used for advocacy, they've been used in all sorts of different ways that perhaps we couldn't have predicted, so something that's quite flexible as well.
Thank you. Michael, from your perspective, what's the thinking, what's your thinking? And it would also be interesting to know a bit more about what the government's thinking is, given the high-level panel that the Prime Minister is chairing.
So on the same question?
Yes, on the
Okay.
same question of what have we learned from the MDGs, particularly what have governments and donors learned from the MDGs, and how's the thinking within the UK government going forward?
I think Claire hit on some of the really important points of the MDGs which worked, and some of them haven't worked very well, but the MDGs which worked is they were short, punchy, measurable, concise, and easy to imagine. When you think about maternal mortality and infant mortality, it's very easy for people around the world to imagine what this might look like. Whereas if you think about a target potentially on, say, universal healthcare systems, it's much less tangible, much more difficult to imagine in human terms. So I think the MDGs which have worked well have had that, you can imagine in your mind what it looks like. And they've been, the ones that have worked well have been in areas where there's really no controversy. Nobody can argue with reducing infant mortality. So I think that's a lesson. I think there is also a lesson about a little bit of a danger, as with any of these things, a little bit of a danger of hitting the target but missing the point. That in the way that MDGs were implemented, there was such a focus on the measurable aspects that we didn't pay enough attention to the transformational change that had to happen around it. And I think one of the things that the Prime Minister is very interested in is looking at what are the things we need to do to address the causes of poverty and long-term transformation and empowerment rather than just buying good results. There's quite a lot more to say, but I'll stop at that, Adam.
Okay, thank you. Phil, what's your view on from Oxfam's perspective?
So I suppose there's many things to be said, and some of them have already been said, so I won't repeat them. I think, from Oxfam's perspective, one of the great things about the MDGs was that it set out a global set of minimum aspirations that everybody was buying into. When I say everybody, I obviously put some quotation marks around that because there was a real fundamental flaw with the process, as well as some really important good things about the process. But those values and norms, many elements of civil society, particularly actually in more authoritarian societies that find it more difficult to advocate strongly to their governments, and it's difficult enough in democracies, can latch onto those and really use them as something that apparently is something that everybody has bought into, and so it allows just an extra lever. And many of, and I can't emphasize enough, for some elements of civil society, an extra lever to really ask more of their government in terms of the provision of basic health and education to the poorest. Those levers are often absolutely vital. I think one area that's where the MDGs have really failed is on MDG 8, which was supposed to be the aspiration of us all having a trading system that was going to be fair, access to medicines and all these other things. And obviously, I think in terms of the measurables, that's the place where I would describe it as a catastrophic failure. You know, we don't have the intellectual property rules that ensure that poor people can get access to medicine. We've had substantial advances on that, but they've been like pulling teeth. And equally, the disastrous results of the Doha Development Round effectively shame us all. So those are some of the great things about it and some of the real difficulties.
Which I think brings us into some of the business questions here, because in the early days of the MDGs, it started as an OECD initiative. It was very much driven initially by aid ministers in those countries. Over time, it's been taken up by an increasingly diverse array of stakeholders. But Andy, the business community was not a huge voice in the early times of the MDGs, but it's become much more interested in them more recently. We at the This is Africa, we speak to the likes of Philips, the likes of Unilever. All of these companies, they think about their business in Africa, which is the area that we cover, and they think about the MDGs as a part of what they're doing when they move into, especially when they move into low-income countries. So what's your perspective on where the business community fits into the MDGs, and how have you seen, both within SAB Miller and also among other companies, the MDG discourse being taken up in the talk of the companies and how they're going to expand?
Okay. I think the MDGs were helpful in being high-level aspirational goals that many people could connect to, including many people in business. And clearly some of them have been delivered, but I want to be somewhat provocative if I can to get the debate going and say that a couple of things really. One is that I'm not convinced that many of those who were involved in delivering the development and the growth that actually has helped us meet some of the MDGs in certain parts of the world even knew the MDGs existed, or particularly focused on them as they developed their work in that area. I think a lot of the progress we've seen, particularly around some of the goals that have been fulfilled principally in India and China, has been through a whole series of entrepreneurs, small and big, driving their business, driving their own success, and having a big benefit in society as a result. And you listed some companies, and of course, you know, within SAB Miller, the MDGs are fairly well known, and we talk about them. But there are not that many companies that really have understood their impact in development terms. There's only a very small number of companies, and some of them are here tonight: Unilever, SAB Miller, maybe Standard Chartered, one or two others, who've done a lot of work to understand their impact in development, using economic multipliers or looking at, say, environmental footprinting. And therefore, I think it's quite hard to say that the MDGs are a kind of currency that has been alive in the business community, or that it's had a particular influence on how business has developed. I think it's been much better in the last 5 years than it was in the previous 8 or so. But still, I think we've missed a huge opportunity. And so the challenge I'd set for the next phase is how can we engage a much broader spread of business, not just in the accountability piece, the bit about, you know, what should you do as business to meet these minimum standards on human rights or environment or transparency, good as those things are, but in much simpler ways of helping businesses big and small to understand the multiplier effect of their value chains, to understand how they can take different decisions but around their core business that actually drive much bigger development impacts. And for that we need to be quite simple and quite widely applicable.
Thanks. Just wanted to pick up again with you, Phil, because this business question I think is just an interesting one to stay on for a moment. You've touched on some of the really controversial issues around, for instance, intellectual property. The pharmaceutical industry is a big part of delivering health, but there are still a lot of debates around patents and so on. Of course, we've also got an increasing attention being given by yourselves and others into tax and tax evasion, tax avoidance, transfer pricing, and so on. And still no real strong commitment from the rich world, and especially not from the OECD, to aggressively go after this. We interviewed Angel Gurria a few weeks ago. Clearly, there are plans afoot to sort of improve the contribution that businesses make in developing countries to pay their tax and so on. But do you think that the frameworks need to be more aggressive? They still seem a little bit voluntary. Often, for instance, on tax havens, you can only register an objection if you already know who the tax evader might be, and so on. What's your perspective on that?
Well, thank you for raising it. In terms of the first thing to say is it is estimated that around $160 billion are lost every year from the poorest countries through tax evasion. Now there's two parts to tax evasion. One are the people who want to avoid tax, and the other people who provide the tax havens where they can do that. and one of them is just up the road in the City of London. And unless we are prepared, and this is one of the most difficult things I think for the next round, is that unless we are prepared to start asking that governments can collect sufficient revenue from business in their own countries in an effective and predictable fashion, then we will not be able to achieve the kinds of increase in equality and the kind of increase in investment in climate finance which is going to be necessary for them to be able to adapt, but also to be able to get onto a path of lower carbon development. And so for us it's absolutely essential that business sees its responsibilities in terms of paying tax where wealth is generated, and being able to and for governments, particularly in the north, who are the main ones who have some oversight of tax havens, actually start to close those areas down. Because we know, if you speak to most chancellors and ministers of the Treasury, they will tell you that they can't do it because of the tax havens. So this is one of the fundamental issues that faces us in the next round of any post-MDGs, I believe.
Claire, what's your take on this? It's a more political, it's a more sort of heated discussion. A lot of the MDG discourse sometimes is very back-patting, everyone sort of congratulating each other, but actually there are some conflicts here, aren't there? There are some disputes, there are some debates.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a choice. Partly it's a choice between the what and the how. That the current MDGs that we have are sort of split between a series of whats, of outcomes, reducing maternal mortality, tackling specific diseases, increasing access to education, and then this MDG 8, which is this, everyone agrees, this very weak goal, which is focused on the how and the sort of partnerships that are needed to get there. Now, a lot of the debates around post-2015 at the moment are focused on the sort of extent to which it might be politically possible to sort of beef up the how without jeopardising the process that we've made on the what, and the kind of balance between the two, and the desire to hold on to what have been some gains in terms of measuring progress, incentivising progress, providing this, fairly uncontroversial but set of targets which nonetheless have been quite useful for individual groups in terms of getting particular changes out of governments and other institutions. The extent to which, we kind of bank what we've got in a sense and don't try to rock the boat, or whether we do push on some of these more controversial but things which there's a bigger risk attached, but obviously if we did manage to make progress on some of those things like tax, to take a completely different example, some of the environmental objectives that are also being proposed for inclusion in the current round, the gains would be enormous, but the risk is much greater. So it's really, that's what I think a lot of politics is about at the moment, is people trying to sort of balance and trade off these more controversial but more important things with these less controversial things, but where perhaps because there's more of a consensus, there's less of a gain to be made, because a lot of what we want will happen anyway.
Michael, what's your perspective? You understand the politics. You're involved in the politics. How do discussions within political circles around some of these issues?
Well, I mean, Phil's really very right that we have to find a way to enhance tax revenue for all countries all over the world, and particularly if there's a government which is taking less than 15% of GNI in tax, there's a real problem. Just very difficult to sustain a state. There are a number of things to go into there. I mean, for DFID, for example, invests very heavily in enhancing revenue collection. And, this is not a problem, and we're really clear about this, this is not a problem that's going to go away if you get transfer pricing and tax transparency right. And even if you tax big business really, really effectively, there's still a residual problem about taxing people in the rest of the economy. So when thinking about the really important issues around tax, we need to capture all of it. The one thing I would say about the MDGs is, like Claire, I have real appetite to explore some of the more difficult issues as well as the ones that have high consensus. But I would say that not every human problem has a goal-shaped solution. And there are other kinds of processes out there, other multilateral processes, other ways of tackling things. And I'm really keen that looking forward the next 15, 20 years, we create structures which are good for business. We want more entrepreneurs. We want more wealth creation. And we want, we don't want people to get away without being taxed properly. But we can't just focus on the negative side of business. It's really, really important to focus on what are the conditions business needs to thrive, because that is the exit from poverty.
So looking ahead then to post-2015, the process through which the MDGs were developed was obviously very different to the process through which they will now be redefined and reconstituted. One of the biggest differences is that now many more people know about them, so a lot more people want to be part of that conversation than originally when nobody really knew about them until they'd already been announced. So going through all of the panel members, if you have comments, what do you think the process between now and 2015 will look like? Is it the case that we need something to replace the MDGs? Do we need to focus in on the ones where that have only recently become sort of donor priorities and try to understand better how we might continue to achieve the goals? If the MDGs expired, what would replace them? Claire, we'll start with you.
Oh dear. A lot of questions there altogether. I think the process between now and post-2015 and 2015, I think the first thing to say is it's a bit uncertain. We don't really know what's going to happen. There's a number of different processes that have been sort of thrown into the air simultaneously around the post-MDG development agenda through the high-level panel, which is meeting in London from tomorrow and so on, and the commitment to negotiate sustainable development goals and a separate group having been set up to negotiate those. So I think it's very uncertain. What do we want? Do we need goals at all? Should we, what would it matter if any of those processes, if all of this collapses? I think it would matter really for two reasons. First of all, I think there is a certain momentum. I don't think that this is the single thing that will make the difference between a sort of good world and a bad world, and we shouldn't overhype this exercise. But on the other hand, I think there is a certain momentum that's been built up, a certain, demonstration that there is a value in having these sort of global consensus on some big things. I also think, to some extent, this process is a bit of a sort of canary in the multilateral coal mine. If we can't agree if world leaders can't get together and agree a kind of common agenda on something which is as morally uncontroversial as ending poverty, then really we might as well forget about agreements on some of the really big stuff like climate or trade or, the things that really are going to affect our lives sitting here in a much more immediate way. So I think it matters for multilateralism as well as mattering in terms of the specific objectives around poverty reduction, yes.
Michael, what are the key things for you, especially as we look at the high-level panel and what their discussions will be? What are the key things that you want to see brought in between now and 2015 and thereafter?
Well, I think, Adam, where we are is we're looking to the high-level panel reporting by the 31st of May, 2013. There will then be about a 2-year-long negotiation process through the General Assembly, possibly through the Open Working Group. I think a lot of that is quite fluid. So one of the key things the high-level panel needs to do is to deliver a report which helps tee up that conversation. And there are big risks around that conversation. Some of the people have heard me say this before, but there's a big risk that we're going to agree nothing. It is the canary in the coal mine of multilateralism. And we have an awful lot of multilateral processes in recent years that haven't agreed anything very useful. The second thing is we agree too much. We agree a huge, long laundry list of everyone's wishes, which means it'll be fairly useless. Third is we will agree things that are vague and woolly and impossible to actually measure whether they're being implemented. Fourth, we might agree something that is politically unimplementable. But most of all, the biggest risk is that, the last set of MDGs were drafted by a very small number of individuals in a short period of time, and they were sneaked into the framework of a General Assembly resolution without anybody noticing. And that's why they're crisp, sharp, well drafted. We're now talking about a huge process which every single UN agency, every major lobby group in the world wants a piece of lobbying on what this looks like. That's not a recipe for nice, concise, sharp targets. So the risks around that are huge. The high-level panel has to tee this up, but where Prime Minister Cameron's view is we really need to look to the future. We're in a different world. The investment in health and education and nutrition is really important. We need to keep that going. But looking forward in a new world where we're seeing rising incomes, middle-income countries being important, We need to pay attention to what's it going to take to generate private enterprise, what's it going to take to give people systems of accountability they can be empowered by, because after all, we're not talking about aid existing forever, and we need to kind of head for more sustainable approaches. The big challenge, I'll stop at this, Adam, because I'm talking too long, but I think the big challenge is the poverty community and the environment community are in very different places. I've stopped talking about the MDGs, and I've stopped talking about sustainable development goals. I've started to talk about global development goals, which I hope would, I mean, that's not necessarily the right phrase, but I think sustainable development goals are very labeled as environmental, MDGs are very labeled as poverty, and we need to head for one framework that reflects the real choices that entities like SAB Miller and Unilever and others have to deal with all these things at once, and we need to kind of reflect that in an integrated framework.
Thank you. And I definitely hear this concern about having a lot of people in the room, and I don't know if anyone here was at the Durban climate talks, but I think that was my experience. I actually was in one room where I think there was a 3-hour debate around what qualified as marine life in one of the sentences on page 1050. So there are dangers there. On the business side, where's the business audience in this discussion? Do you think that there is a role for business as a voice in shaping the post-2015 landscape?
Well, I think the process needs to start with and heavily refer to 3 things which are going to happen anyway. One is that the growth in middle class consumers is projected to go from 2 billion a couple of years ago to 5 billion by 2030, an additional 3 billion people. Now, that may be slightly delayed if China slows down a bit, but it's still the trend. Second, that's going to occur in a context of quite rapid urbanization. China is going to urbanize another 300 million people over that time frame. Africa is looking, if you listen to John Beddington, the UK's chief scientist, looking at by 2025 another 1,000 cities of 500,000 people on the coast. And that's all happening in a context where there are very serious limits on resources, and we can't actually deliver that improved quality of life to that additional 3 billion middle class consumers if we don't make some dramatic changes to how business and their value chains and all of us use resources. So they're the things that will happen anyway. So for me the question is, how is it that the kind of the process that develops around both the SDGs and the post-MDG process connect to those trends? How can we think about how the major actors in those trends, the small entrepreneurs across Africa, in which certain countries are growing very fast, across India, across China, can actually be engaged in that to have a more holistic, a better inclusive development? And I think if we can start with those trends rather than necessarily a particular UN process, we might get an interesting broader church to pursue development with.
One of the things that I've noticed when I speak to some businesses and investors in Africa about these issues is that often they say to me, look, we're already effectively providing many public services ourselves because they don't exist. So we already have a generator at the back of our office for power because there's no grid. We already have health clinics for our workers because the government hasn't been able to provide any. So some businesses have been pushing back a little bit on this discussion by saying that actually, we are already doing a lot of things that government should be doing, and now we're being expected to suddenly play a role in development goals which really the public sector should be taking care of. What's your view about that view?
Well, I think lots of businesses do have generators and water treatment plants and all sorts of things they need to survive in more difficult operating environments, and we have many of those. But actually, I think that's a relatively short-term view. I think that the scale of resource challenge that we'll see because of those additional 3 billion middle-class consumers, the scale of some of the social tension we might see because of that pace of urbanization, particularly in parts of Africa, will I think quite quickly instruct any business that actually, unless they're part of a broader set of solutions, both at the global level and in their local operating environments, then their success will be threatened. And instead, I think the way to tell it is the other way, which is that for the GDP growth that underpins our business growth to succeed, we actually need broader social development. We need ecology protected. And that's why we get involved in a number of partnerships, not so much philanthropic, but around how we protect our core business growth, like our work, a partnership called Water Futures with WWF and GIZ and a range of other local partners, including the Nature Conservancy around the world, which is all about seeking to, in water scarce areas or areas that are at risk of water stress, seeking to protect the water source that we depend on, recognizing we'll only get it in a more tense future if community gets their needs met and if ecological flows are protected. So I think you have to think in that kind of way. And for business, that can be quite difficult, particularly for a business like ours that's run by engineers. The people have grown up understanding, the people that run our businesses around the world, understanding the world in a sense as a series of CapEx projects where you have a solution, you can put in place a project plan, you can put X million dollars towards solving it, and bang, you've resolved the problem within your fence line. And that's not the way business will need to operate in the future. And that, in a sense, is quite a big cultural change for business, as well as it is for people outside business.
Thanks, Phil. From the NGO side, and especially the international NGO perspective, what are your thoughts within Oxfam about how this plays out to 2015?
Yeah, the high level. I mean, I think Michael's absolutely right when he says, first of all, is that the high level panel needs to look to the future, but also that we cannot have something coming out that's not crisp and sharp. And the high level panel, in a sense, has all the benefits of the small group that created the MDGs. And so I'm really hoping that the high-level panel will be able to deliver something that is tight and not politically expedient, but bold and radical in its vision. Because from our perspective, we face, in the next 5 years, probably critical decisions that will define the path of this planet over the next 50 years. And the high-level panel has an opportunity to really define some of those key decisions that have to be made, and in which the post-MDG goals, the global development goals, whatever we're going to call them, can play a critical role, because the voluntary goals that these will be do play alongside the binding agreements that are made, because it allows business, civil society and governments to see that there is some commitment, and we can at least hold each other informally to account. So from our perspective, first of all, there's the ecological crisis. And the ecological crisis is intimately linked to the issue of development and poverty reduction. We have now entered the Anthropocene, according to the Earth scientists. We have left the Holocene. All the major Earth systems are now defined by man's activity, whether it's ocean acidification, whether it's climate change, whether it's biodiversity and the catastrophic loss of biodiversity that's going on at the moment. So we have to be able to tackle that. And it's just, as we enter the Anthropocene, it's just not going to be in any way feasible to say, oh, we're just focusing on poverty and development. We're not going to talk about that, because the two are now absolutely indivisible. Secondly, coming back to this issue of inequality, I mean, we live in a world of quite obscene inequality where there is redistribution and it's going in the wrong direction. We now have 1% of the world's population, the richest 1%, that control 40% of the wealth of the planet. That's 1% controlling 40%. The bottom 50% control 1% of the wealth. Now, I'm not after a Maoist vision of revolutionary socialism, but there has to be something in there that's disturbingly unsustainable about the future. And it's interesting that the World Economic Forum this year has inequality as one of its top, in the top ranking numbers of the most dangerous things for the planet to deal with, alongside with the Communist Party of China. So when those two come together and start to say inequality has reached unsustainable, socially unstable levels, I think the high-level panel should grasp that and really see ways in which we can go about attacking it. And I do also, say that has to be about growth with equity. We're not talking about, and therefore business has a role to play in this, but it has to be about growth with equity. Governments have to have the ability to do some of that redistribution of the wealth that's been generated in order to be able to reach the kind of social foundations that are necessary. And that's why Oxfam's come out, this is my last bit, why Oxfam's come out with this donut economics, which the Earth scientists have now defined 9 planetary boundaries. And we've already crashed through 3 of them: biodiversity, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle together, and climate change. But inside that outer circle that defines a safe space, operating space for humanity, we should also place an inner circle of social foundations under which no human being on this planet should be expected to live. Now that's everything from governments define that as everything from gender justice to access to health to access to education, etc. But if you put those 2 circles together, that ring which is formed effectively describes a fair and safe operating space for humanity. It gives us an enormous amount of freedom as humans on this planet to operate, but it also provides boundaries outside which we are in tremendous danger, either because we have 1 billion people as we do now going to bed hungry tonight, or because we're outside the planetary boundaries, and our climate, which we've depended on for the last 10,000 years and which all major civilizations have developed, is not going to last.
Well, thanks for that very impassioned vision, Phil. That was most interesting. And I think some of his points, Claire, I just want to bring you in here, because some of these issues around redistribution and growth go to the heart of development economics. I mean, Hollis Chanery was writing about this in the 1960s, his famous book, Redistribution with Growth. The debates around, how does a government think, especially in a developing country, about how to prioritize, GDP growth over the distribution of that growth. I know that Paul Collier has written that the problem of the so-called bottom billion, as he calls them, is not that they've had the wrong kind of growth, but they've had no growth at all. So if you have growth, then you have something to work with. If you don't have a strategy for growth, then the country is poor, and even if everyone's equally poor, everyone's equally miserable. So where do you see this through your work with ODI, because you're looking exactly into these issues of equity and growth? Do you think that there is a trade-off, and are there any countries which are pursuing a policy framework which shows that actually it isn't growth first and redistribution later? You can do this stuff in a synchronized way.
I don't think there is particularly a trade-off. I think there are so many different examples of different growth paths with different social impacts at different times, depending on the sort of structural over different time periods, with different starting points, given different resource endowments and so on, that the sort of pursuit of trying to identify the trade-off or lack of it between growth and equity is almost as bad as trying to trace any relationship between economic growth and overseas aid, which is a similarly doomed endeavour as far as I can see. But I think the interesting question is really, I think that the shift that to some extent the MDGs have been part of, and that we all need to kind of remember as we come into these conversations, is that in a sort of pre-MDG world, we held growth up there as the objective of development policy. That was what it was about. That's what structural adjustment was about. Let's have growth. That's what we're all about here. And then after that, we can kind of just sit back and assume that all the social benefits will come. One of the things that the MDGs would have done is to really sort of consolidate a very different consensus about what the objectives of development policy are. And they're saying this isn't actually a project which is about economic growth. This is a project which is about improving people's lives. And clearly, as we know, economic growth is an absolutely fundamental part of that. But let's not, in this discussion about the role of business and the next generation of goals and the importance of providing jobs and of keeping, and of thinking about economic growth, let's not swing the pendulum right back again to this other world where we were in the 80s and 90s, where we were saying, no, it's all about growth. Because I think we have to hold on to that insight and that consensus that really it isn't. What it is about improving people's lives. And what we know is that growth is a very important part of that, and therefore we need to have something to say about how growth can do that and how governments and other institutions can help that happen in a new framework. I mean, there are some really interesting examples at them. You asked me about country examples, and there's some very interesting and kind of illuminating examples within middle-income countries about the different extent to which very far sort of growth in different big middle-income countries has been translated into poverty reduction. So, for example, famously, Brazil has seen not particularly spectacular rates of growth, but falling inequality and really impressive progress on poverty reduction. Whereas India, for example, has seen much higher rates of growth, but has been not nearly as successful in translating that growth into the improvements in people's lives. So I think really those are the examples we need to think of, not get back into some kind of 90s world of is it growth or is it equity, but to think about what are the very concrete things that we know. For example, what the Brazil program, what the Brazil example says is something about redistribution, about social protection, about actually taking money off, from somewhere and giving it to somewhere else. As kind of in all the complexity of our thinking on poverty, we slightly lost sight, I think, again, of that insight that actually just giving people money is really quite helpful when you're trying to reduce poverty. And for me, you know, the Brazil example shows in spades that really is true and it works.
Although you could say that one of the problems with structural adjustment was that it didn't create growth.
Yes.
But anyway, that's another
Yeah, I buy that too.
Your comments about Brazil and India are interesting because from the perspective of anyone who looks at sort of the history of development economics, especially if you like late developing countries and post-war, would tell you that actually the countries that have really transformed the welfare of the poor have done it through a process of structural transformation, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China. It was an industrial strategy, an economic strategy for transformation. It generally wasn't a targeted process of social spending. And I know that there are certain people like Hajun Chang, for instance, at the moment, who's quite critical of some of the current frameworks because they're very ahistorical. They don't actually say, why don't we look closely at South Korea and what they did? Why don't we look closely at Japan and what they did? Because once people have jobs, then they have income, and then all of these other social questions can be solved because people have got money in their pockets. Do you think that we need to actually move back to a state where we're thinking more about country-level strategy? There's always going to be a role for aid, and South Korea was a major recipient of aid in the Cold War, of course. But we find that all the countries that have really managed to crack this, they've ultimately done it within the government, and they've come up with a strategy within the government.
Right, there's a lot of questions there. Let me try to remember what they all are.
I suppose I could boil it down to say, you know, is there a risk that we're not thinking enough about what an individual government needs to do and the facilities within the WTO and so on that it needs to be able to do that?
I think I would come back, to Michael's point that not every problem that countries address would necessarily be solvable through this goals process. I think two broad points coming out of that. First of all, on the point about structural transformation and jobs in particular, I think there is a broad consensus. It's certainly something which I hear very often from civil society groups and governments in Africa particularly, that the current MDGs didn't pay enough attention to issues around economic transformation, infrastructure, jobs, and that created some kind of perverse incentives, particularly for very aid-dependent countries who found it easier to get aid for building the school than for building the road that would help to get the children there, for example. So I think there is an issue about balance and making sure that a post-MDG agenda does tackle the sort of a good range of the things that we know are important to development. But having said that, I don't think it can tackle everything. And I think that some of the things, the sort of examples from Japan, from South Korea and so on about the importance of very specific, long-term, politically negotiated development strategies and active governments and kind of active governments which can be competent but can also bring people along with them. We can't create an agenda which sets out a blueprint for all of that, because the whole point of that is that it has to be country specific, and that there are sort of paths that countries have to be pushed down by their own political processes, their own economic structures, their own history. So I don't think that what we're looking to create is a sort of single royal road to development here. But what we're looking to create is a consensus around the end point.
We might say that donor countries could actually make it easier for developing countries to pursue that strategy in international forums, which they're not currently free to do.
Absolutely,
so
and that gets you back to the MDG8 issue, and as Phil said, you know, the question about fairer trading rules and a lot of the promises that were made in the context of the MDGs and have not been fulfilled. It's really difficult. Again, I think, you know, the fact that we haven't got an agreement in the WTO shows how very difficult it is to negotiate trade deals. And we shouldn't expect the MDGs to come along, or a post-2015 agreement to come along and wave a magic wand and make that all okay. The politics are the politics. And, you know, you can put trade into a post-2015 agreement, then you import a lot of those same problems that exist because it's the same countries in the room into your post-2015 agreement. There may be something about the sort of moral power of an agreement which is so explicitly aimed on at ending poverty that would allow you to crack some of those particular nuts around some of the aspects of the trade, of the sort of trade problems and so on. But I don't think, it's the same group of countries in the room negotiating and all these things, and they have the same interests and the same domestic constituencies and all the rest of it. I don't think there's anything magic about post-2015 that can actually solve what are just very difficult problems.
Andy, you wanted to make a point.
Well, I just wanted to completely agree with Phil and Claire on the equity point and the benefits of growth, because I don't think any business that has seriously global ambitions would disagree that having quite a stark income distribution actually stifles the opportunity for you to grow your business. I mean, just from my own business, we're primarily a beer business across the world, also soft drinks sometimes, in 70 markets. You look across Africa, outside of South Africa, the value of the informal illicit alcohol market is 3 times the value of the formal beer market, the formal alcohol market. So actually, if we want to grow, if there's an opportunity for us to grow, in a way that brings people to a kind of better regulated product, a product which is taxed, a product which we, in Africa in particular, aggressively use local sourcing from local farmers aligned with government agricultural strategy, then actually I think there's a big opportunity for business there. And I think business increasingly sees this bottom up, and is doing, in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of businesses build out their own value chains to have a bigger development impact. The problem comes when you suddenly realise these value chains are kind of sitting in somewhat in isolation, in parallel across the economy. And one of the most healthy things I think we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is the building of these projects and programs around ecosystems that help connect all this up. So Grow Africa, the project with a range of businesses, with the African Union, with NEPAD, with a range of others, looking at how the big businesses that source from agriculture across Africa and have many small businesses in their supply chains can work together to improve infrastructure in certain geographies where they're working together with the agricultural growth corridors in Tanzania and elsewhere. To look at how business skills, microfinance, a range of things can actually be provided together. Now, we're on very early stages of that, but I think that's quite exciting in terms of how bottom-up we can see the benefits of growth through, for example, engaging subsistence farmers work much more rapidly. I think also business is beginning to see that if it doesn't lead to a scale change on the problem that we're tackling as a whole, then the business won't benefit from the solution. So water for us is a very good example. We rely on a clean and regular water supply to make beer. There are many places where even with us investing in watershed protection programs in, say, in Rajasthan in India, the operations that we have will still be threatened. And so that's where we need to have a whole range of local businesses, big and small, and government and NGOs working together to crack a problem together. And so I think we have seen some of those partnerships grow. I think that they're of real value in terms of both hitting the environmental limits piece and also the equity piece. And I guess the final bit I want to say is that we had great growth in the world until 2008, but it was massively wasteful. If you look at the food system, with 30% waste in both the developed and the developing world, I mean, there's a huge opportunity in different ways in different parts of the world to kick that waste out of our economies and share the benefits more broadly.
Thank you. Phil, the last word with you.
Yeah, the role of the state is going to be fundamental to the future. We need responsive, accountable, effective states, and I think there's a broad consensus on that now. And the old structural adjustment of let's shrink the state and get shot of it so we can let the market rip is not really where the development consensus is as much anymore. But I want to just come back to the high-level panel, because the high-level panel is not going to be able to sort of make big remarks, I don't think, about those areas of governance, except where the governance really hits the issues that are important to some of these goals. So I would say, the high-level panel could make a goal about reducing inequality and the sharing of benefits in society. I think it's Claire who wrote about, could we have one about a reduction in the Gini coefficient, which is just one way of stating that. There are other ways of stating it as well, but that a goal of reducing inequality would be fundamental. Just to say that there's many ways in which different countries have done that. Brazil has had a phenomenal reduction in its own inequality over the last 9 years. It's halved hunger in the last 4 years, in just 4 years, through that effective redistribution, just taking 1% of the income of the top 10% and giving it to the bottom 20%, and doubling the minimum wage. The minimum wage was so appallingly low, it barely registered. And it was, I remember the FT about I think it was 93 elections, is calling on the Workers' Party, Brazilian people to elect the Workers' Party because it was so incredibly inefficient, the Brazilian economy, because it didn't have any domestic economy, because the skewing was so great. So that's where the growth inequity comes in. Vietnam, on the other hand, already has a relatively equitable economy. It has halved hunger in 9 years by investing massively where poor women producers are, and making sure that both public and private investment is going, whether it's credit, whether it's extension services, new roads, are going where those poor women producers are. South Korea, I would also add, did quite a lot of redistribution under the threat of communism and China by doing a massive land reform, which again redistributed the wealth out and allowed a domestic economy to really be generated in that country. The other one I'd say is, the other place where the high-level panel can go is to say that we need to keep below 2 degrees centigrade. We know that above that, I should say 1.5, all right, because that's Oxfam's policy. But let's face it, we're heading for 5 or 6, so we'll have to start to be reasonable. But if the high-level panel can at least say that, again, many civil society elements, parts of the private sector will use that to put pressure as a lever on their governments to say, what are you doing? What's your share of that burden? And again, it will just allow people under that voluntary agreements, which will be the next generation of this, to do something about it.